Good. Well, hello, everybody. Very delightful to see you from the four corners of our beautiful globe. And so I'm going to talk to you a bit about this book and give you a kind of an overview of it, I suppose. I thought that might be the most useful thing. And I'm going to show you some pictures. So I need to just do the whole share screen thing, if that actually works. Is that going to work? You don't want to look at my Facebook page. You want to be looking at this. Is that a thing? Can you see that? Do you want to give me a thumbs up, Don, if that's right? Good. Okay, so I spent the last couple of years kind of hunkered down in my house, reading and researching and interviewing more than 100 people to write this book about imagination, because I found myself reading people like Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein and George Monbiot and people who I really admire and respect, I kept seeing this phrase come up where they would say climate change is a failure of imagination, a failure of the imagination. And I would be left thinking, that's really interesting. By which time they would have moved on and be talking about something else. So this phrase, climate change is a failure of the imagination, started to really kind of land with me. And so that's really what I want to talk about today. And I wanted to just start, I'm sure this is not news to any of you, but it's something that I find myself, my wife is very, very involved in Extinction Rebellion. I find the Extinction Rebellion movement has been really fascinating in terms of how it has raised the profile of the climate debate over the climate change over the last year or so. So I always like to start just with a couple of minutes of what they call tell the truth, just for a bit of context. So this is the biggest ice core that we've ever extracted. And ice cores like this give us a really accurate record of climate going back, in this case, 2.2 million years. And it can tell us the CO2 concentrations and what the atmosphere was like at that time. From this particular ice core, the biggest one we've extracted, we learned that for the last 2.2 million years, that the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere has fluctuated, but always stayed below 300 parts per million. So everything as human beings that we love and as part of our history and our culture, and from the development of carrots to King Tutankhamun to I don't know, Nina Simone, all of these things kind of emerged within this kind of a band. And just within the last little while, we pushed out from that band. We've broken free of it for the first time. And we're now at about 412, 413 parts per million. And we're seeing things happen, the global climate, when we've gone up 1.1 degree from pre-industrial levels that are way ahead of what we thought we would see happening. These fires, awful fires we had in Australia, the flooding that's happening right now here in Wales and the north of England, awful things happening around the world at 1.1 degrees. And we know that once we go between 1.5 and 2 degrees, we'll see global crop failures. By 4 degrees, billions of people will no longer be able to be sustained on this planet. And at 6 degrees, we kind of turn the lights off and go home, really. And so, and at the moment, the current trajectory is that we're going to pass 1.5 in the next 5 years, that will pass 2 degrees in about 2035 and 4 to 6 degrees somewhere around 2070. So this is of the most enormous urgency. This is not something anymore where there is any, we can't argue with physics anymore. The urgency here is absolutely profound, which means we need to be making cuts of about 10, 11% every year, starting right now. So that, for me, when I read this about saying climate change is a failure of the imagination, it really struck with me of saying, why is it that when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change say we need to see rapid, far-reaching and urgent changes in all aspects of society, why is it that we go, oh, like that's never going to happen, or we don't need to do that, rather than going, great, fantastic, okay, brilliant. So we can think of food in a different way, and we can we know, which is the kind of thinking we've really been cultivating and nurturing in the transition movement in the last 12 or 13 years, is that sense of, actually, do you know what? The limits that this imposes on us creates a much more imaginative space in which we can operate. So I'm only going to show you one graph, I promise you, all night. And I don't show you this for the numbers. I show you this for the story, because it has always felt to me that the only way we're going to do what we can do here when we stand at the top of this graph is to tell the stories about the bottom of this graph that are so delicious and so wonderful that they create in us a deep, deep longing for that place. How do we create a kind of a profound longing for a low carbon society, and the food we'll eat when we get there, and the conversations we'll have when we get there, and the parties we'll have when we get there, and how deliciously clean the air will be when we get there, in such a way that we create a deep, deep longing for it. After all, when Neil Armstrong went to the moon and set foot on the moon in 1969, it wasn't like an idea that he just had. You know, we had actually, and when JFK said, we're going to get to the moon this decade, that wasn't his idea. We had been going to the moon for decades before that in stories. Tintin went to the moon, Frank Sinatra went to the moon, everybody went to the moon. By the time Neil Armstrong went to the moon, we'd been there hundreds of times in stories and in different ways that had created that kind of deep longing that made it inevitable we would get there. So the question with me is, how do we do that in relation to the climate crisis? I would argue that we don't do it by constantly showing people pictures like this and constantly saying it's going to be a catastrophe and it's going to be awful, and putting dystopian ideas in front of people all the time as a way of trying to motivate them. They motivate some people, they motivate me sometimes. But what would it be like actually if in our culture and in our narratives, actually we were to show people pictures like this? We would say, this is what the place where you live could look if it became absolutely alive with biodiversity. If we said we want our cities to become reservoirs for biodiversity and to live where we kind of rewild our cities and we live surrounded by nature in this way. How would it be if our cities were like this? Once we get rid of the cars out of our city, we have an enormous amount of space. 2/3 of the surface area of Los Angeles is dedicated to cars. Once we start to take some of that space back and make the centers of our city car-free spaces, as is happening now in a number of European city centers, there's an awful lot of space we need to do creative, imaginative things with. Us, the centers of our cities could look like this. They could be full of food being grown, our children walking to school through abundant food gardens. All of that is entirely possible and is already starting to happen in a number of places. But we have to be able to imagine it first. And we have to create a culture in which people feel that they can imagine and talk about these things. And so I don't know if this is going to work. We'll see if this will work. One of the things we did to promote the book was I made a little 2-minute film, because people would sometimes say to me, so Rob, when you try to imagine this, what's in your head? What does 2030 look like? We made this little video, which is kind of a walk through a day in the life in 2030 and a dip inside Rob's head in 2030. And let's see if this actually works. Okay. Can you hear? This is my apartment. I wake up here and get my kids up ready for school. Go on, kids! These apartments were built 14 years ago with strawberry walls and using local materials that are heavily efficient. A composting toilets and this. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Rob, can't hear anything on my end, and I'm seeing a number of people typing into the chat.
Mind.
So maybe just have to send people a link.
I'll send
describe
people.
It.
Yeah, I'll send people a link. So sometimes people say to me, well, Rob, that's all very nice. That's all very naive. And actually in the real world, that's not really going to happen. Well, part of the delight of the role that I have in Transition Network is that I get to go and visit many places across Europe where this is already happening. This is a place in France called Montsartou, which is about half an hour inland from Nice, which is a town where about 5 years ago, the French government made a new rule to say that all school meals should be 20% organic. And in Montsartou, they said, well, if 20% is better than 0%, why do we stop at 20%? Let's just go straight to 100%. So in Montsartou, all of the food is 100% organic, and 70% of it is grown in this market garden on the edge of the town, which the municipality there bought the land. It was going to be developed for housing. They bought the land. They turned it into this market garden with polytunnels. They grow the biggest chard I've ever seen in my life. It's a fantastic place buzzing with biodiversity and bees and butterflies, creating work for people. The kids come up and visit it. They learn what the plants are. They learn to cook. They found that since they made this change in the schools, what has happened is that now 60% of families who before never bought organic food now buy organic food. So the behavior change and the ripple effects from a project like this have been huge. So when I look at a project like this for me is a win-win-win-win-win-win response to climate change. It's good for mental health, public health, biodiversity, local economy. It's good for kids and their education. It's good for families and so on and so on. It has so many benefits, way more than just allowing one company to come in and provide school dinners. So many of the solutions, the strategies that we can bring to tackle climate change begin with, and have this same element. If we get them right, there are many, many benefits to them. So I read a couple of years ago this research done by a researcher in the US called Kyung-hee Kim, where she looked at something called the Torrance test for creative thinking. That goes back to the early 1960s, huge data sets of people, where they'll do things like they'll show them a cup and say, think of as many uses for this cup as possible, that kind of thing. And her conclusion was that imagination and IQ rose together till the mid-90s, and then IQ kept rising, and imagination went into what she called a steady and persistent decline. And when this was published, it made the front page of Newsweek. It was a really big story. People said, oh, what does this mean for economic growth? What does this mean for Hollywood and Pixar and so on and so on? Nobody ever said, what does this mean for the climate movement, social justice movement, the ecological emergency that we're facing? And when I read this, I thought, this is really, really important, because if people can't imagine first the world we need, if we're losing the capacity to imagine a different world, if we're losing the capacity, that muscle, that imaginative muscle, it's not like imagination disappears, but it should be a muscle like that. And actually, if it's like this, then that's really, really important thing that we need to look at and address and design into our activism if we're trying to work with people whose imaginations are not as strong as they should be. So what I want to share with you this evening is in 9 kind of bits, 9 what-if questions, which are the chapters of the book. So it's kind of a little whistle-stop tour through the book based on 9 what-if questions, because I think those words, what if, are the 2 most important words in our language at the moment. And you could think of this webinar as a kind of long love poem to those 2 words, what if. My first what if question is, what if play was at the heart of every day? And it came initially from the woman who wrote that report, from Kyung-hee Kim. She said one of the reasons why she felt imagination was declining was because we were seeing the demise of play, of what she called free, unstructured play. Children just playing, doing their thing, no adults with clipboards standing around evaluating what they're doing, just children playing in the way that many of us remember from our own childhood, in a way that is largely disappearing. These are some beautiful photos of sort of children's play street culture in the UK in the 1960s. This was how children learned to cooperate, to manage conflict, to take risk. When we produce a generation of children who can't take risks, we produce a generation of adults who can't take risks, which is absolutely the last thing that we need right now. This kind of street games culture, I think, peaked sometime in the kind of late 50s, early 60s, and has been slowly declining ever since, to the extent where it has largely been purged from our public spaces. At this point, our children are almost expected to start compiling their CV now from the age of 4 as they're ferried from class to class and after school activity to after school activity. And our streets are kind of cleansed of this, but it's really important to a culture and a community. The former mayor of Bogota used to say that the number of children playing in the streets of a city, should be seen as one of the key well-being indicators of that city. And actually by that measurement, we're doing really, really badly, because it has pretty much gone. So I was really keen to see, where could I find a place where street play was being welcomed back, where people were intentionally making a space for play to happen again. Street. I went to visit the city of Bristol, near where I live, where there's a fantastic project called Playing Out. And Playing Out supports families in 60 streets across that city and in other parts of the country to close their streets for a night a week during the summer and an afternoon a month during the winter, so that children can come and play. You need two parents who'll stand at each end and just look after things. You need kind of the agreement of most of the neighbors, things like that. But I went to the street on a Wednesday evening, and it was full of children playing and skipping and skating and drawing everywhere in chalk. It was fantastic. I spoke to one mother who said, this isn't anti-car, this is pro-community. I spoke to one father who said, well, we realized after 6 months that we actually quite liked each other. And you could see that not only were the children learning to play, but it was bringing the adults back together again, which is one of the functions that it served originally, I guess. So so it was fantastic to see what it feels like again when the streets fill up with play. One mother said to me, all you have to do is get the cars out of the way, and this happens. It's not like play has vanished or the urge to play has vanished. It just has a space in which to express itself. In my town here in Totnes, a couple of years ago, we did a street games festival where we took over a square at the top of town, and people were invited, children were invited to come and learn some of those traditional street games. For the first half, it filled up with kids playing, and all the adults stood around going, this is great, isn't it? Look, children are playing. And then the second half, the adults realized they could play too, and then it was just absolute mayhem. It was just wonderful. And one of my favorite games from the day was this Dutch game called Spijkerpupen, where you get a piece of string and you tie a nail onto it, and then you tie the string onto the back of your trousers, and then looking backwards through your legs, you have to try and get the nail into the neck of a bottle behind you. It's absolutely fantastic. This girl was playing this game for about 10 minutes, completely immersed. If any of you have children or grandchildren and you worry about their attention span, their ability to concentrate, I really recommend Spijkerpupen. You might introduce it next time you're at work and you have a big staff meeting or something. So it was just wonderful to see when you create the space for play, the kind of thing that emerges. But actually, all too often, play is something that we buy for our children. This hideous monstrosity that I will introduce to you now is called Hello Barbie, and Hello Barbie was created by Mattel in 2015. And Hello Barbie was the first smart doll in the world. So this doll would have conversations with your child and record the answers, and then use the answers to build a detailed marketing profile of your child, which was then bought and sold with other companies. Thankfully, in the US, thanks to a campaign called the Center for Commercial-Free Childhood, they ran a campaign called Hell No Barbie against this thing. Which actually led to us drop in anticipated sales of about 90%. And they argued this is a direct attack on your children's imagination. This will murder your child's family of imaginary friends, because it can be used for nothing other than being Hello Barbie, having a conversation with your child. And what I had always wanted to do was to be able to interview Hello Barbie when I do talks, to ask her for her views about imagination. But actually the app was discontinued, so I can't do that anymore, sadly. So, but you can get the script, you can get Hello Barbie's script. And my favorite bit of Hello Barbie's script is she says something like, now that we've been and used our imagination, no, hang on. Now that we've been and used our imagination and played games, let's get serious and talk about something really important, fashion. Can you imagine? In Germany, these dolls have been classified by the German government as illegal espionage apparatus. So I was wondering how could we bring play more centrally into our activism, into the work we do as activists. This is something that we developed in the transition movement initially in 2012. Some of you might have been there when we first did this at the Transition Network conference at Battersea Arts Centre in 2012, called Transition Town Anywhere, where a group of people, 200 or 300 people, come together and first of all, they imagine themselves traveling forward to 2030. They imagine themselves in that world of 2030, a world which is the result of having done everything we could possibly do between now and then. 10 years of the most phenomenal, profound social transformation and extraordinary change. And they're in that world, and then they meet up with other people who share their interests about what would be happening in that world, and then they together co-design things they would be doing in that world. What work would they be doing? What would their role be? And then physically, we then built that world from cardboard. We did it again in October in the same venue. It was just phenomenal to see 300 adults completely lost in play. Is one of the most utterly magical and extraordinary things. And when we did it this time, these two young men here built the public transportation system for Transition Town Anywhere. They could tell you everything about this vehicle here, what it ran on, how it worked, how the whole system worked. It was just fantastic. And sometimes people say, well, that's very nice, but how does play help you to actually manifest real, tangible change in the world? So I'll tell you a little story. This is me in 2012 when we first did this exercise at Battersea Arts Centre. And the thing that I ended up playing with other people, as you can see in the picture here, was called the Yeast Collective. And the Yeast Collective was a bakery and a brewery and a mill in the same space. We thought that is such a brilliant idea. You know, why would we not have those everywhere in 2030? And so we designed it, we built it, we planned what the beers were called, what was in it, how it worked, who we were going to trade with. We talked to everybody else in Transition Town Anywhere and figured out our role in that whole economy. It was magic. I still meet people who are at that event where when I start talking about it, they get all kind of misty-eyed and talk about how impactful it was on them. The year after we did that exercise, I went back to my town in Totnes and started a brewery called the New Line Brewery, as Don mentioned at the beginning, which has been doing really, really well. And we always had this dream of moving into the same building as a bakery and a mill. Last year, we launched a community share option to raise the money to convert the business into 100% community-owned business. We now have 270 owners. And so when people would say to me, but Rob, how do you know that it will work, having a brewery and a bakery in the same space? I say, I know it will work because I played it. I absolutely know it will work because I played it. I spent a day immersed in it and I played it into existence. And there's something very, very powerful, I think, about using play in that way. So my second what if question is, what if we considered a healthy imagination vital to our health? I think all too often imagination is seen as something kind of a bit of a luxury, something a bit frivolous. It's not something serious or important, but it's fundamentally important to our health and well-being as human beings. This is the hippocampus, which is part of your brain, kind of in the middle, kind of about here in the middle. It's shaped like a bit like the wishbone on a chicken. You have a left and a right side to it. It is the part of your brain where your memory and your imagination fire from. And neuroscientists increasingly think actually memory and imagination are almost the same thing in many ways. The thing that's most interesting about the hippocampus is it is the part of the brain that is uniquely vulnerable to cortisol. So when we are anxious or stressed or traumatized, the hippocampus can shrink by as much as 20%. And when that happens, we lose the ability to think about the future in hopeful, positive ways. We get stuck in the present or in the past, and the future kind of disappears from view. And when I found this out, because I'm not a neuroscientist, but I was reading lots and lots of books about the hippocampus and interviewing neuroscientists, and actually it felt like a really powerful kind of allegory of the world that we live in today. You know, we seem to be creating this storm of cortisol that people are living through. We're living in the age of anxiety, an epidemic of loneliness. We have a record levels of mental illness among young people, huge levels of burnout and exhaustion. And we're creating in our cultures, the perfect conditions for the hippocampus to be shrinking, with the resultant impacts on our collective ability to be imaginative. So it left me thinking, where can I find a place where they are intentionally setting out to rebuild the hippocampus, a kind of a campus for the hippocampus, if you like. And I went to visit a place in Dundee in Scotland called Archangel, met this amazing woman called Rosalie Somerton, who it's in a first floor office block in the middle of Dundee, one of the poorest cities in Scotland. And their philosophy is, when you go there, you're not a client or a patient, you're an artist, preparing work for an exhibition. Every year they put on an exhibition in the biggest art gallery in the city. And it was just awesome. And everybody knew I was coming up and they were happy to tell me their stories. I spoke to one woman, she said, I spent the last 4 years in my pajamas. And 6 months ago, I came that close to taking my own life, even though I have 2 beautiful small children. I've been coming here for 6 months, and now I can see the future again. I spoke to so many people for whom that was their experience. It was extraordinary. And every year at Archangel, in order to sustain their funding, they do kind of evaluation about how well what they're doing is working for people there. And they don't give them a big long questionnaire. They give them a piece of paper with 2 outlines of a human body, like 2 gingerbread men. And they say, fill out the first one to show how you felt before you came here, and the other one to show how you feel now you've been coming here for a while. And I looked through a pile of these. They were very, very moving. I just want to share one of them with you, which I think for me kind of doesn't really need any words and really captures the power of the work they're doing there. When I look at this picture, I feel like if we are successful in making the shift we need to make in the next 10 or 15 years, this is what it'll feel like. I feel like the figure on the right is kind of what a low carbon transition future will look and feel like if we actually get there and are able to do it. I remember I went out with their photography group. There was a young man there who was very, very socially awkward, couldn't look anybody in the eye, was very self-conscious, but was going around with his camera just taking pictures of different things. And when we got back, he uploaded his photos onto a big monitor so we could look at them. And they were all things like drops of water on the door of a telephone box, or a golden toffee wrapper in among a pile of autumn leaves, and things like this. And it was like he was learning to see again, learning to connect with the world again through observing and seeing and attention. And it was so, so powerful. So for me, there is something really important about saying that we need to create the best conditions in which the imagination can flourish. So my third question, what if we followed nature's lead? All of the most imaginative people in our culture, our poets, writers, painters through history, take a lot of their inspiration from nature. And there's lots of research that shows that we are more creative when we spend time in nature. Even half an hour walking out in nature makes us much more creative. 4 days in the wilderness with no smartphones and no distractions like that really has a huge boost to people's ability to be creative and to be imaginative. But we're living in a world at the moment where the diversity of the world is contracting hugely. During my lifetime, or since the Beatles split up, depending on how you want to look at it, we've lost 60% of all the creatures we share this planet with. 60% of all the creatures. And I think when we live in a world where of what Michael McCarthy calls the great thinning, when we're living in a time when that diversity is diminishing and depleting around us, that has a real knock-on impact on our imagination. It's one of the sources that's feeding into our hippocampus and shrinking it. There was a microbiologist called René Dubos who used to say, if we lived on the moon, our imagination would be as barren as the moon. So when we live in a world where we see that contraction taking place, I think it's one of those things that is having a really, really harmful impact on our imagination. So everything that we can do to expose ourselves to as much nature as possible and bring nature more into the places where we live has a huge boost on the imagination. In the north of Scotland, there's a doctor's practice there who, when people go to see the doctor reporting depression or anxiety or obesity or whatever, the doctors prescribe the nature connection. They give them a little book with activities to do every month. So they say, for example, for the doctor to prescribe to you to say, in May, bury your face in the grass, or turn over a rock and see what's underneath it, or sit cross-legged on the ground and listen to the birds in June. Actually, how different would our healthcare system and our mental health care system be if our doctors were prescribing nature connection to people, and how much of an impact would it have on our imaginative capacity? This is a map of London, but not a map as you've normally seen it. And there is a guy who lives in London called Daniel Raven Ellison, he calls himself a guerrilla geographer. He took his son to visit all the national parks in the UK, all 15 of them, came back to London, and being a geographer, he made this map of London, where he said, this is London without the bridges, the roads, the buildings, the supermarkets. This is just the green spaces and the blue spaces, including everybody's gardens, everything like that. And when you actually calculate that and you work out all that, 49.5% of London is green space and blue space. So he said, if we could make another 0.5% green and blue space, then the majority of London would be green and blue space. So London would be a national park. So he created this project called London National Park City. And last July, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, designated London as a national park city. And it's a beautiful project because it says, in order to do that, that's 1 square meter for every person in London. So where's your square meter? Is it at work? Is it your place of worship? Is it at school, your university? Where are you going to do that? And the whole movement of the London National Park City is based around what if questions. They say, what if the bird song in London was so loud that it drowned out the noise of traffic? What if the rivers were so clean in London that you could swim to work? What if there were more trees than people in London? It's beautiful. And having that good framing what if question has made the most enormous impact on that project. What if we fought back to reclaim our attention? What's attention got to do with imagination? Well, the way I always like to think about it is I invite people to imagine that they are in Arles, in the south of France, in 1888, in the Yellow House on Place Lamartine, in the little kitchen, in that little house, and Vincent van Gogh, sorry, as you would say, comes into the kitchen carrying a big bunch of sunflowers he's just been given by his friend Patience Ascelier, the gardener, whose portrait he painted the week before. And he comes into his little kitchen and he arranges this beautiful bunch of sunflowers in a small earthenware pot on his table, and the sunlight streams in through the window, and he sits back on his little wicker chair that he bought recently with money that his brother Theo sent him down from Paris. And he sits back and he looks at these beautiful sunflowers, and then he gets out his smartphone and he thinks, oh, I'm just going to check my Instagram page, and I'm just going to check my Facebook page and my Twitter and my Pinterest and my email. And then 2 hours later, he's watching videos of skateboarders falling downstairs. And he can't remember why he even started looking at videos of skateboarders falling downstairs at all. If that had happened, we wouldn't have this. And all that this has done for decades and decades of people. This is in the National Gallery in London. Whenever I'm in London and I feel a bit depressed, I go and sit in front of this picture for an hour, and it fills me up with sunlight that sustains me for the next 6 months. This picture is distilled attention. All art is focused and distilled attention. All great works of the imagination are distilled attention. And at the moment, we're living in a time where our ability to concentrate, our ability to focus is contracting and contracting and contracting, partly because of these devices we carry around in our pockets, partly because of what being online does to us. And as Nicholas Carr writes in his book, The Shallows, we used to have a relationship with knowledge where we had sufficient attention capacity to dive deep into knowledge. And that's where wisdom comes from in a culture, when we can read and really immerse ourselves in ideas and reading for hours. That's where the wisdom comes from. Increasingly, we kind of water ski across the surface. And our relationship with knowledge is becoming really, really superficial. And one of the guys I interviewed for the book, Sven Burkert, he said, we are losing the very paradigm of depth. And I think that has real implications in terms of what we're trying to do around climate change. We have become in our culture terrified of being bored. We have kind of purged boredom out of our culture. You see, if you get in an elevator that goes up more than 3 floors, out come everybody's phones. If you're in a queue of more than 3 or 4 people, out come the phones. If you're in a traffic jam where you're going to be sitting there for more than a couple of minutes, out come the phones. That time is the time when our imagination is calling us. That's the time to draw, to dream, to daydream, to look out of the window, to write, to make up songs, to do that kind of stuff. That's the time in our culture for our imagination, and we are driving that time, filling it with other things. It's so precious that we actually give that time the respect that it is due. What if school nurtured young imaginations? What if people left school at the age of 18 with their imagination honed like a superpower? We came out of school feeling like anything was possible and that we could be the people who did it. That's largely not people's experience today. And actually, increasingly, I've written several books where I have to research a chapter at the beginning about climate change and read the latest climate science and try and interpret it in a way that's kind of makes sense to people. I have to say that the chapter in the book about education, what our education system in 2019, 2020 is doing to young people's imaginations, was almost as depressing and heartbreaking as reading climate science. The devaluing and the purging of arts from our education system in our public schools, the rise of testing. Children in the UK now of 4 taking days off school from stress because of tests that are being posed. Absolutely hideous. So I was really interested to see where could I find models of education and schools who are saying the imagination is really important. The cultivation of imagination is fundamental to what we do. And all the schools I spoke to, and in the chapter in the book, there are many stories people I spoke to around the world. All of them talk about this place. This is in the north of Italy, Reggio Emilia. And it's a place where in 1945, all that was left as the Germans retreated north back into Germany was a tank and 3 trucks and 6 horses the Germans left behind. And the local people sold those things and used them to build a school. And it was based on the fundamental idea of how do we create a system of education that will ensure that fascism never happens again. And central to their philosophy is that at the heart of every school is what they call an atelier, a workshop, where you can go at any time of day or night, and maybe not night, any time of your school day, and someone will help you to make whatever it is that you want to make. And they don't teach in subjects, they teach in projects. They say the building itself, they call it the third teacher, that is vital in terms of light and plants and so on. They talk about children as being beautiful, competent, creative, authors of their own learning. Absolutely beautiful method. And it struck me when I was reading this that actually what we have done in education systems in most places in the global north is to create the absolute opposite of this. And then we wonder why we're seeing the resurgence of fascism and these kind of ideas, because we're doing the complete opposite of what this model of education is talking about. This is a school in the city of Plymouth, which is near where I live. Big city, naval port, pretty kind of poor city, left behind for a long time. They have a really great art college. And the guy who runs the art college, a guy called Andrew Brewerton, started to notice that he was having lots of conversations with young people who would say, we love it here. They were 16, they'd just arrived at art school. They'd say, we love it here. And he'd say, why do you love it so much? And they'd say, we've spent the last 12 years trying to pass tests and trying to guess what the right answer is in our teacher's head. And this is the first time we've done anything creative in that whole time. And we love it. So it set a seed growing in his head of saying, what if we created a school from 4 to 16 based on an art school. And it's such a beautiful question. What if we have our schools, all schools should be art schools, should work in the way that art schools work. So that's what they have. They built this school where their brief to the architect was that it should have no corridors. They said it should have no room that resembles a cell designed for 30 inmates. And and at the heart of the school downstairs, they have they have an atelier, which is a food atelier where kids can go and learn how to cook at any time. This is what the classrooms look like. They're like the studios in an art school. It's just the most beautiful system, and it's something which could really work absolutely everywhere. The idea that we make schools more like art schools. What if our storytelling was able to bring a positive future to life? Because for me, there's one of the things where when it's one thing to imagine a future, a kind of transition future, it's another thing to be able to be really good at sharing that story with other people, bringing it to life in other people's imagination, that ability that really great storytellers have. And I saw at the beginning, we have some storytellers here on the call. That idea, that ability that storytellers have to activate all parts of our brain. If I said now, oh, and I'm just about to eat this really amazing fresh cinnamon bagel, the part of your brain that would activate if you actually smelt a real cinnamon bagel would activate now just by me talking about it. If I said I kicked a football through a window, that's the bits of the brain that would activate when you kicked a football would actually activate. Storytelling is incredibly powerful, and those drawings I showed you at the beginning of the cities of the future were drawn by this guy called James Mackay. James Mackay is the man who draws the future. I like to think of him. He works at the University of Leeds. He's a graphic novelist who interprets science and kind of gives it graphic. Sometimes he goes and sits like this by the side of the road. He sets up an easel and he starts to draw what he sees in front of him. And as people walk past, he says, "Excuse me, how do you think this place might look in the future?" And then he draws people's ideas into his picture. He says, all you need is a really simple sketch. That's all you need. And then people's ideas just flow out. So there's so many ways working with the arts and storytelling that we can use to try to bring to life in people's imagination this kind of future. But why does that work? Now, this is a couple called Jackie Andrade and John May. They're researchers at the University of Plymouth. And they developed this thing called functional imagery training. Functional imagery training, what happens is you work with people who want to change something in their life. Maybe they want to lose weight, or they want to change addictive patterns or things like that. They work with them to help them create what they call like a multi-sensory imagining of what it would be like. What would it feel like and smell like and taste like to step out of the shower after you've really exercised really well? Or when for the first time you can go for a run with your kids, or to really imagine that when you feel the sun on your skin when you're out running and you can hear the birds above you. And once people have created this powerful mental image, what they call creating a memory of the future, creating memories of the future, what it does is it gives people a kind of a new North Star to work towards. It's really, really powerful. And the research they've done has shown that when they do this, people make changes, and then they sustain those changes. It's a very, very powerful, this idea of creating memories of the future. How do we create memories of the future around transition, around a low carbon future? It's a really powerful question, I think. This guy here is called Per Gronqvist. And where's my little note? Oh, I've forgotten it. So this is Per Gronqvist, and he works for the Swedish government, and his job title is Chief Storyteller. Fantastic, fantastic job. And his job description is something like to bring to life the realities of day-to-day in a post-carbon world. I mean, what a beautiful, beautiful job, and a beautiful, beautiful job title. Every country should have a chief storyteller. Every local government should have a chief storyteller. Every organization should have a chief storyteller. Every activism group, every community should have a chief storyteller. We should all become chief storytellers, gifted at telling those stories about what day-to-day living in a low-carbon future would look like. So what if we started asking better questions? This feels to me like one of the things we need to most master is how do we become really good at asking what-if questions? So, stories. This is in London, Transition Town Tooting. Transition Town Tooting. Tooting is a part of London where they have a really busy main road and lots of shops, and nowhere that's like a village green or a town square or a kind of a people's place. There's one place it could be, which is here, which at the moment is a bus turning circle, full of buses waiting to be called somewhere else. They sit there all day with their engines idling. The air quality is awful. Transition Town Tooting said, what if that was our village green? And they created an event called the Tooting Twirl, where one day in July last year, they took over that space and they filled it with flowers and coffee and music and carnival. They put real grass down on the ground. I got to sit with my shoes and socks off on the green grass of Tooting. And the thing that was most fascinating during the day was to hear the conversations change. They started out saying, if this was our village green, halfway through there, people started saying, when this is our village green, it was like somewhere deep underneath, the permission shifted, the permission started to change. It was just an exquisite thing to see. And as that conversation went on, I noticed people looking at this wall, which if there was a competition in London for London's most boring wall, this would definitely be in the top 3, I think. A wall that nobody would ever look at normally. When people spent the day here, I heard people say, when this is our village green, what are we going to paint on that wall? What story about ourselves and our community and what we love about it will we paint on that wall? Beautiful. And it was felt like over the day, something deep kind of shifted underneath in that conversation. This is a couple also from London in a place called Walthamstow called Dan and Hilary. Dan's a filmmaker. Hilary is a most amazing printmaker. And they live in a community where they were becoming increasingly heartbroken about seeing the impacts of austerity, the austerity imposed by the government on that community. They were seeing the rise of debt, of people getting into dreadful levels of debt and food insecurity and so on, food poverty. So they said, okay, what can we do? What if we took an artistic, creative response to the debt crisis? And around that time, the last bank on their high street closed. So they said, okay, we're going to take over the bank. They occupied the bank. They turned it into what they called an act of citizen money creation. They started screen printing banknotes, which were then, as you can see behind them, hung up like washing throughout the building to dry. These were not a local currency. These were like limited edition artworks in different denominations, all signed by the bank manager, Hilary, in other words. And each of those notes celebrated a different person in that community who is stepping in to catch people who are falling because of austerity. So, for example, the 2 Steves here run a project keeping young men out of gangs. Tracy is the head teacher at the local school who lost all of their funding for the arts. Gary is a guy who mortgaged his own house in order to raise money to convert his garage to turn it into a food bank. And Sarah and her family run a project where they feed 200 people 2 meals a day, free of charge. Just phenomenal. These are the people who should be on our currencies, not the Queen. And the aim was to sell £50,000 worth of these notes, which they did. And there's a beautiful film you'll find on YouTube so half of that money they then distributed among these 4 charities. So there's a beautiful film online of Tracy, the head teacher in the school, being presented with a suitcase with £5,500 in, and all the kids going, "Wah!" As a result of this. The really smart bit then was that the other half of that money they used to go to the secondary debt market and buy £1.2 million worth of payday lending debt from that neighborhood and writing that debt off. Phenomenal. This buying and selling of debt that happens when debts aren't repaid, and payday lending debt being the debt that preys on the most impoverished people. So once they had done this, and they paid off this 1.2 million pounds worth of local debt, they wrote to everybody whose debt they had paid off and said, you know that debt you had, well, you don't have it anymore, and we have cleared the debt, and good luck to you, and have a good life, and we don't ask for anything in return. But one thing is, you might like to join us next month on the 9th of May on a piece of waste ground overlooking Canary Wharf and the Bank of England. And when people turned up, there was this van here that was painted gold and was filled with little bits of paper with debt written on it. And then at 10 o'clock that morning, filmed, I think, partly as the kind of the climax of the film that they had been making about this whole project, they then blew the van to pieces in a big explosion. And then painstakingly afterwards picked up all the pieces of the van from the explosion, and all the people who had bought bonds that they had issued were then sent in the post these little collectible artworks of bits of the van, and they melted down the metal and made special commemorative coins that everybody got. I just love this project. For me, this was like, if we're upset about an issue like debt and we want to campaign, what can we do? We can make a blog, we can make a petition. Or we take over an empty bank and we fill it with printmaking, and school groups come and the community come. And in the evening, that space is used as a public awareness education program around economics. Or we do, all of these, and then we make a van and we blow it up, and then we make coins out of the metal. Our activism, if it is suffused with imagination, is so much more powerful, I think. And when I was there and they were printing the notes, I met Sarah, who is the woman who does all the feeds to 200 families a day, who was gold foiling the notes with her face on. And I said, what does it mean to you to be part of this, to appear on one of these notes with your face on? She said, for us, it's like Christmas. This is like Christmas. This is a transition project from Liège in Belgium, which is a former kind of industrial city. And it's a city where that you can't really grow food in it because it's so polluted. But they started a project called Ceinture Alimentaire, which means food. And the food project, this is a project which it started with a what if question. They said, what if in a generation's time, the majority of food eaten in this city were grown on the land closest to this city? Such a beautiful question. And I was there 5 years ago. They did a big event. They invited chefs, academics, farmers, baristas, anyone who cared about food. I didn't hear anything for 4 years, and then I went back last March. And in that time, they'd created 21 new cooperatives. They raised 5 million euros of investment from local people. They started a farm, 2 vineyards, a brewery, which I had to go and visit. We all have to make sacrifices for the transition movement. They started a shop called Les Petits Producteurs, the small producers, growing food from local farmers. They put them out, they tell the story, really cheaper than the supermarkets. Within 6 months, the first shop was doing so well, they opened a second. They've now opened a third and a fourth, and the first one has now doubled in size. I spoke to this guy, Pascal, at the top here, who manages it. I said, how far can this go? He said, I think by the time we have 12 of these shops, the supermarkets will start to fragilize, was how he put it. Fragiliser, this beautiful French word. We don't really have in English, but it kind of works. I met the mayor of the city who said, this is now the story of Liège. We see our role as a municipality as just to get out of the way, remove any obstacles to this spreading. They're now looking at how the hospitals procure food, how the schools procure food. It's a phenomenal project. It's a city reimagining its food infrastructure, but it started with a what if question, a really good one. So I have 2 more questions for you. And this is possibly, certainly in the UK in 2020, one of the hardest questions, and I imagine it may be for you as well. What if our leaders prioritize the cultivation of imagination? If we're living in a time of imaginative poverty, if we're living in a time of a kind of perfect storm of factors that are causing our collective imagination to contract at the very time it needs to be expanding, then how do we create politically and economically the best conditions for the imagination to flourish? I think we need, we need legislation that enshrines the right to an imaginative life. And one of the things that I looked at was, well, where can we find democratic structures that are inviting the imagination. So this is in Barcelona, in Spain, where a few years ago they had what's called a municipalist movement took over the city. In the election, it was lots of young people who had been very involved in the kind of Occupy type movement called 15M that happened across Spain, who said, if we're going to actually do what we need to do, we need to become the government of this city. So now all across Barcelona, every neighborhood has assemblies. They have neighborhood assemblies, and each of those assemblies meet up and then they suggest policy ideas to the city government, as a result of which Barcelona is now politically, I think, one of the most imaginative cities in the world. The stuff that's happening there is just fantastic. They're creating an energy company for the city. They talk about the feminization of politics in the city. It's just brilliant because they've paid that attention to the democratic framework. And what we're seeing happening in the UK now, off the back of Extinction Rebellion and different things, is that now more than 70% of local governments have declared a climate emergency. And we now see a number of the big cities who are kind of in competition with each other to become the first zero carbon city in the country. And this is in Nottingham, which is maybe out in the lead at the moment, not a city you would expect, really. Nottingham, I read a piece recently where the deputy mayor of Nottingham said, our philosophy is very simple. If it doesn't move, we'll put a solar panel on top of it. And if it does move, it has to move with low carbon energy. And again, that felt to me like a municipality who were creating a space that really invited people to imagine and think about the future in different ways. And there's a city in the north of England called Preston, which, you know, if people put the word model after the name of your city, you know you're probably doing something right. And in Preston, they in 2011 they had one economic idea for the city, which was they were going to build a huge shopping mall in the center of Preston. And in 2011, that whole scheme collapsed and crumbled. The main retailers pulled out and they were really left with nothing. And they sent one of the young councillors off to do some research to say, where can we find new ideas of different approaches? So he was inspired by the Mondragon co-ops in Spain. He was inspired by the Evergreen co-ops in Cleveland, work in Jackson and different places like that. And he came back and they mapped the economy of the city. They said, where does all the money we spend go? Every year, we spend £750 million of public money on goods and services. Where does it go? Nobody knew. So they did this research. They found that only 4% of that money was spent into the local economy. And the rest of it just poured through their fingers like water. And so they sat down, that's the university, the hospital, the municipality, the schools, and they said, okay, we need a different approach. And so what they do is they look at those organizations as being what they call anchor institutions, that they spend more and more of their money to support the local economy, to support local co-ops, to change how they do tendering so that more local companies can apply for it. So they've created a space for people to create worker co-ops, energy co-ops, food co-ops, and the whole economy of that city is starting to be reimagined with space for lots of people to step in and say, I've got a piece of that. Recently, they were voted as found to be the most economically improved city in the whole country. And it's because they're taking this different approach of creating a space for the imagination to flourish. This amazing woman here is called Gabriela Gomez Mont, and she works for the mayor of Mexico City, where he asked her to create something which was conceived of as being a ministry of imagination. Sounds like something out of a Harry Potter book. In Mexico City, it's a reality. And half of her group is made up of engineers and planners and architects. The other half is made up of filmmakers and poets and artists. And their job is to look after the kind of the imaginative life of the city. When I interviewed her for the book, she said, imagination is not a luxury. We should not only be thinking about building cities for the human body, but also for the human imagination. They say when we start thinking about the future of the city, our starting place must be what's already happening here. Loads of stuff's already happening here. How do we build off that? And in in Bologna in Italy, they have what they call a civic imagination office, which I heard about 2 weeks before I finished the manuscript. I was like, oh, how have I not heard of that before? That's amazing. And tracking down the guy who had started it, a guy called Michele D'Alena, it was just amazing. They work like a transition group. They do visioning, imagining, future, dreaming work. And then the The smart bit is that when they do that and the community come up with ideas, the municipalities sit down with them and say, that's a great idea. Okay, how are we going to make it happen? Let's make a pact. We can offer this, this, and this. You can offer that and that. Good. Okay, let's make a pact. And in the last 5 years, they've made 500 pacts in Bologna, from really small things like a garden in a street through to taking over an old office block and converting it into a center to train young people to become classical musicians. So that bit about pacts is really important, because it's about how do we meet imagination halfway. We invite people's ideas, they write them on post-it notes, we throw them in the bin when then we carry on doing what we were going to do anyway. No, you have to meet imagination in the middle and create the best conditions for it. So my very last what if question for you this evening is, what if all of this came to pass? What would it be like to live in a time when anything felt possible, when we were surrounded by deeply imaginative local governments? We were, when those questions like, well, why does it have to be like that? Why do we have to have organizations like that? Let's rethink them. How would it be to live through a time like that? And that's kind of what we try and do in the transition movement. For me, this thinking process that I did over the last couple of years with this book really led me to a position of looking, we can look at the transition movement through many different lenses. It's a social movement. It's a kind of it's an economic development tool. It's a kind of inner process, community development process. It's many different things. One of the things it is, I think, is an unusual and increasingly rare creator of what if spaces, holder of what if spaces, and firer of people's imaginations, because it gives people now a taste of what the future could be like. I remember visiting Transition Crystal Palace, who started an amazing food market which won every award for new food markets in London. And I said, why do you do this? And they said, because we want our children to grow up thinking that this is normal. And it's what we do in transition, whether it's small things like start planting trees, starting a little garden, starting a hop club, or bigger things like a community energy company, a housing project, really big things like what they're doing in Liège. Those kind of things are so important because they create a space where people can see them and smell them, and it starts to shift our reality, our sense of what's possible. It's like kind of pop-up tomorrows that we can live in and inhabit and kind of test drive a different way of living. And I think for many of us, it's felt like a long time, the work that we do in environmental work has felt like the work of Sisyphus trying to push this rock up a hill. I'm sure many of you will sympathize. It feels like we're pushing against the prevailing culture. We're pushing against the media and the overwhelming narratives that surround us and what is considered normal. I feel like in many ways right now we are balancing at the top of this moment of a tipping point. Deep underneath our feet, the tectonic plates around these issues are starting to change. Fossil fuels are finished. They're the new tobacco. Divestment is growing apace. We're now here in the UK, because of so many places declaring a climate emergency, seeing airport expansions being refused planning permission because of climate emergency declarations. We're seeing fossil fuel plants being refused planning permission because of climate emergency declarations. For me, it feels like the momentum is really building. And the thing that I always try to bear in mind is that we always base our experience of what's possible and what we imagine to be possible on having spent so long trying to push a rock up a hill. But we have no idea what it would feel like to be on the other side of that hill, with gravity behind us, with the culture behind us, with the finance coming in to support what we're doing. It will feel completely different. And already I get tastes of that in different places. I visit many places that feel like the tipping point has already started and has already been passed, and people are already trying to catch up with us. So when people say, oh, well, there's no way we can do what we need to do in the time available, I think we neglect to imagine how fast things move when the cultural permission changes, when the longing is in place. We put a man on the moon in 9 years, pretty much starting from scratch, in a movement where the average age of people in that project was 26, they said the reason for that was because those people have never known failure before. So, you know, my sense is that we are on the verge of things kind of accelerating. And I would just leave you, I suppose, with a couple of things. One of which is, after I finished the book, I have a lodger in our house who's also called Rob, who was studying at Schumacher College, and he came to a workshop I gave, and then he said, could he do his dissertation about the book? And I gave him a draft of the book as it was at that stage, and we had several conversations about it, and we came up with this sort of model that kind of distilled the book, which is what I'd like to offer you, really, which was 4 things that help us to create the conditions for the imagination in society. The first one is space. Imagination needs space. We all know in our own lives, when we are stressed or anxious and with deadlines, we're not very imaginative. When we ride our bike in the forest, we take time out, we have space, we put our computer in a drawer, then we're imaginative. Albert Einstein's best ideas all came to him riding his bike under the trees. So whether we have a universal basic income or a 4-day week, or in our groups, we need to create space. In our organizations, we need to create space for people to meet up and ask, what if? We need places. We need places around us we can go to where we're able to think about the future in different ways. Places that create a kind of platform for us to have imaginative lives. We need practices like visioning the future, like building places out of cardboard, things we can do together as groups that unlock our imagination, help us feel more imaginative. And then the last one is pacts. We need to work with the organizations above us to say, we can do the imaginative work, but you need to meet it halfway and create pacts with the community. So we value the imagination and we give it its due and the respect that it's due. So the other thing, I just wanted to finish with my favorite quote out of the book, which is a quote at the very beginning by Neil Gaiman, who is an author. He said, "We all, adults and children, have an obligation to daydream. We have an obligation to imagine. It's easy to pretend that nobody can change anything, that we're in a world in which society is huge and the individual is less than nothing, an atom in a wall, a grain of rice in a rice field. But the truth is, individuals change their world over and over. Individuals make the future, and they do it by imagining things can be different." Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Rob. As we mentioned at the beginning, we're going to have a little time for questions here. But I'm wondering, since we have just about 15 minutes left in this event, if you might be able to stretch your time a little bit, Rob.
I can, yeah. I'm sorry. I when I'm looking at the slides, I couldn't also look at my clock. So I'm aware I overran ever so slightly, so apologies for that. But yeah,
no problem. It was a wonderful talk, but we got a number of really good questions here. And I just want to say, for those of you who can't stick around past the half hour, that this will be posted to Transition US's YouTube channel within the next couple of days, and everybody who registered will get a link directly to that recording. So if you have to take off early, you can look that up later. So first question, we got a couple questions in advance. This one was from Jimmy Buff with Radio Kingston in Kingston, New York.
Hi, Jimmy. I was on his program a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, great. Well, I thought this was quite a good question. Privilege allows many to imagine a future, a different future, while those struggling with daily life stresses are sometimes prevented from the same. How can that be changed?
Well, I guess that's kind of what I was talking about, you know, in terms of what I saw at Art Angel, you know, is imagination is something which there is a kind of a function of privilege in having an imaginative life. If you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if your needs for shelter and food and so on are not met, it's extremely hard to be imaginative, you know, which for me is where there is a really important question around if we want to create a more imaginative society, it has to be a more equal society. We have to, if we set out to say we must create the conditions within society within which the imagination can flourish, then that involves a fundamental look at how are we creating the conditions where that isn't the case. And so creating, the fact that lots of people live in very acutely stressful lives, where we have austerity, where we're closing down the libraries and closing down the schools and putting people in more and more of an acute state of stress. If we had a government that was elected that said, let's make America imaginative again, for example, to adapt a phrase from elsewhere, then what would you do? One of the things I set out in the book is the idea of, well, what would it look like if you had a National Imagination Act? What would you do? It would run through everything. It would say you can't impose austerity because that's an assault on the imagination of a place. So creating the conditions for the imagination of a country, of everybody in that country, means that we would have an economy fundamentally different to how we would have now, and it would be identical to a transition economy, I would suggest.
All right, another advanced question from Bonnie Baruki of Transition Berkeley. She has a question about what role do expectations play in imagining? In general, do they support and guide, harness, or hinder imagination? And I think I can relate to this a little bit. In our transition trainings, we often have people do this exercise called visioning a post-transition world. And hopefully this is in line with Bonnie's question, is, how do we sort out what is just our expectations versus our unleashed imagination?
So there's an exercise I do whenever at the beginning of talks now, where I get people into pairs with somebody they didn't know before they came, and then I say, we're going to attempt the first act of mass time travel in this place, and I say, you've always wondered what a time machine sounds like? It sounds like this, with everybody joining in, and we'll go, that's the sound of the time machine. And then I invite people to close their eyes, and I say, when we turn on the time machine, we're going to travel forward to 2030. And the last 10 years have been this extraordinary time of social change and transformation. And we're going to go there. And it's a time that people in the future tell great stories about and sing great songs about the guts and courage and imagination of those people. And we're going to travel to that future using all of our senses. And then we'll go, and then let everybody sit there in silence for a minute or two just to go for a walk, and then keeping their eyes closed to turn and talk to their partner and share what they've seen or felt or experienced. And it's always amazing. And the thing that moves me is that people who say, I didn't expect I was going to see that. I thought I would see this, and actually I found myself somewhere different, I guess part of it is when it works well, we break outside of our expectations, ourselves looking at the future in ways that we really hadn't done before.
Yeah, that's wonderful. The question I always ask after that exercise was, what surprised you about what you saw?
Yeah. What always interests me is pretty much every time I do it, the first thing someone says is birdsong. And I've done it where people have said, yeah, there were loads more supermarkets. And it was great because I had this really amazing phone. And, that just
never
comes into it.
It's a bit of a self-selecting group, but still.
No, I've done it with a really interesting mix of people. No one's ever said, yeah, there were even bigger motorways. It just never happens.
What really matters in life. So there were a couple questions. We had John Cherry in the chat and Anna Willow in our Q&A module asking about hope. John says, Rob, how do you keep yourself hopeful? I find myself prone to despair. And Anna was asking about, given that seeing so many things seem to be getting worse and worse, what's your advice for encouraging transition and related work among young people who have lost hope?
Yeah, that's kind of the saddest thing at the moment, I think, is when young people have lost hope. Well, I always feel like if you read the climate science and you have times when you don't feel hopeless, you're not reading it properly. Go back and look at it again. But at the same time, there's so much extraordinary stuff happening, and human beings are capable of really doing extraordinary stuff when we put our mind to it. And there's something called the Rapid Transition Alliance, which people might like to look up, which is a project here in the UK that Andrew Sims has been coordinating, where they've been collecting stories from history of when things change really fast. And there are many, many, many of stories like that about how when people decide this stuff needs to change, it changes really, really fast. So I'd really recommend looking at that. I would also say, I get a lot of my hope from the fact that I get to go and visit and speak to people who are doing amazing things. And, if we just read the newspapers and we watch the news on the TV, we never hear those stories. But believe me, there are so many stories. When I came to the US, whenever it was, 2012, 2013, from the outside, you'd kind of imagine that actually nothing's really happening very much. Everywhere I went, there was so much happening, and I thought, imagine if all those stories were on the news every day. All those stories of things that are happening, and for me, I guess it's not just hope. For me, there's a mixture of kind of rage as well, of actually, I'm not going to let this is not going to win. I'm not going to let these people come out on top in this situation. That's just not going to happen. And so it's a mixture of kind of applied hope and kind of engaged optimism, because I feel like when you bring an optimistic mindset to things, more things happen. And I feel like pessimism is kind of a privilege that I don't really have, I think.
Yeah, I think that's true for all of us. So we had a question from Jack Strasberg about specifically about the transition movement. And we also had a question from Erica Dixon that was more referring to all the kinds of projects that you're mentioning here, but they're both about scaling a movement. Jack says, my thinking is that the movement to create a better world, and of course transition as a significant part of that, needs to be much better organized, united, and collaborative if we want to get to where we want to go. I'm asking what you see happening in this regard in your travels and suggestions as to why we're not doing better at this and what we can do to pick up the pace.
Whoa, that's a great question.
Big question.
Well, I think one thing is that we need to reflect and celebrate what has been achieved rather than always focusing on what hasn't yet been achieved. I think, we are seeing in the transition movement in different parts of the world some really skilled kind of regional organizing, really good regional networks of transition groups. I suppose the most exciting place where I see transition moving along is in Belgium and in France at the moment. In Belgium in particular, where there was a film called Tomorrow that some of you might have seen, Demain, which came out in 2015. That film had an impact which in the English-speaking world is almost kind of unimaginable. It was a film about climate change and solutions to climate change, which ran in mainstream cinemas for 5 months and was full every night. I mean, it was a
great film.
It's extraordinary to even think of such a film here, and everybody saw that film. It was like mayors and companies and business people and school kids, and every screening I went to, more than half the audience were young people. And they made a sequel called Après Demain, which tells the story of the film, and then them going to go and visit all the places, stories of people who said, well, we came out of the film and we all met in the foyer and we were so excited we couldn't go home. So we stayed there for 2 hours and then we planned the project, and this is our project. Loads of projects that then started off the back of that, Ceinture Alimentaire being one of them. And so what's happening there is a kind of, the number of groups in Belgium has quadrupled in the last year. They have municipalities who are now electing people who have come through the transition movement. There are now local governments who have ministers for economic transition, ministers for ecological transition, who are doing participatory budgeting and stuff like that. You see some of the stuff that's happening in Liège and different places. And when I go there, I was there last week, I met with all of the senior officials in one of the neighborhoods there who were basically saying, what do we do? How do we get on with it? You know, and the transition groups are really well networked. There's a very good national organization who is providing great training and who's doing a lot of promotion of the whole idea. You know, it's always hard to take ideas from, you know, how things work in one place and scale them up and say it would work in somewhere else. But if anybody wants to see a kind of a place where transition is scaling and mainstreaming in a really interesting way, then I'd suggest Belgium.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the initiatives that have started more recently, you know, you could look at a garden, somebody improving the soil and enriching it with compost and saying nothing's growing here, but we're creating the conditions for that flourishing.
Yeah, and also I think the thing that's interesting is, you know, there were quite a few transition groups here who maybe the last year or so were starting to get a bit tired, and actually this there feels like there's a new surge coming now through Extinction Rebellion, through all these declarations of climate emergency, and a new kind of energy coming in, and people going, transition, yeah, that's what we need. That's really good. And kind of there's a new energy coming in around all of these, and people saying, well, we're declaring a climate emergency. Well, the transition movement declared a climate emergency 12, 13 years ago. What that we can take from this movement, and there's really interesting work going on about exploring that edge where transition meets Extinction Rebellion, where transition meets municipalities who are saying we've got to declare a climate emergency. There's a kind of there's a new momentum in that part of it for me, I think. Okay. I'm just saw it in the comments thread where Après Demain. So Après Demain, you can find it on YouTube, but it doesn't have any English subtitles. So we are working to get some English subtitles put on it. If you speak French, check it out. It's fantastic. But if you haven't got any French, you might struggle with it a little bit.
Great. So we won't keep you too long, but I do want to ask a few more questions if you have the time for that.
Sure.
So this is a question that's very up, I think, here in the US right now. We just recently had a Politics and Policy in Transition National Working Group spontaneously bloom for the first time, and they're starting to meet. And so John Duvall asks a question about what is the place for national governments and politics in the transition movement? And there was also a question from Janet. I'm not sure I'll get your last name right, Janet. So just say, Janet would like to hear more about the idea of bioregional government.
Yeah. Well, certainly in the US and the UK, national government's not going too well at the moment. I think might be a bit of an understatement. It's been absolutely catastrophically, disastrously rubbish here at the moment. So, you know, we just had an election where potentially we could have voted a government with a 2030 climate change target, who were looking at creating a lot of frameworks that would really have created really great conditions for transition to flourish, and they didn't win. And So, I feel like, when there are the opportunities to elect people who get this stuff and who understand climate change and who push for a Green New Deal, we've rather blown our opportunity to do that, but you're next, I think. So good luck with that. And I really hope that, that you're able to do a bit better than we've done, because actually, if the US were to shift to a position of becoming again becoming a global leader in terms of action on climate change by the end of this year, it would make such an impact internationally in terms of all of that. But my sense is that actually, can we wait for that? No, of course we can't, and we need to use what we have. And actually, a lot of that often means we focus on the regional scale of government, we focus on the local scale of government, and really try and do everything that we can, because that's one of the ways that we push national government to change, is by changing the narrative and changing the story, changing the economic development models that are happening at a community scale. And in terms of bioregional government, I think it's one of those things that makes an enormous amount of sense, but I don't really know how we would get from here to there, given all the vested politics in the current economic boundaries. Although bioregions feel like a really great scale on which to maybe organize networks of transition groups and to base climate emergency plans and to base kind of resilience planning work on regions, feels like they're kind of where they make more sense to me.
Yeah, great. Ben Baylor asks, I'd like to know if there are specific storytelling formats or guides, resources that Rob suggests.
There's so a couple of things. So one of the things I did when I was researching the book was I went to do an improv course, theatrical improvisation. Just such fun, really. If you want to give yourself a treat and learn how to play again as an adult, go and spend a weekend doing an improv course. It's just absolutely wonderful. And there are various exercises you do on that about telling stories, where you start, where you take it in turns telling bits of stories, and it's that difference between yes but and yes and. So you do an exercise where someone makes a suggestion and you reply by saying yes but. It's about that experience we all have of just being shut down all the time you make a suggestion, and instead you do yes and, where you have to build off what the person says before. There's an exercise that I do when I do talks sometimes, where I say the imagination thrives most with limits. When we put limits around it, that's when we're at our most imaginative. So, and what we need in our culture is the stories of ordinary people who stepped up and got this process started. So we're going to do that now. So we're going to tell a story, and the limitation we're going to put around it is the alphabet. So we're looking out for people's shouting out of things like, okay, so somebody called Andrew, and Andrew lived in Berkeley. And what did Andrew do? He was a computer programmer, and he was obsessed with donuts, and met someone called Erica who lived in blah, 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 blah. And you tell this whole crazy story about how they met and they started doing transition and what happened and the projects that came out of it. And it's a really lovely thing to do with people. As the facilitator of it, it's kind of almost like doing stand-up. You have to really kind of go with it and make the story up. But that's a really lovely exercise to do, to bring a bit of kind of collective storytelling into the heart of an event that you do.
Great. So two more questions. One is another merged question about starting out. We have Annapurna left a kind of general comment about how to start a new beginning for creating a more playful, sustainable, and self-sufficient intentional community. And Phoebe Barnard is talking about that she's a scientist, recently wrote a paper, World Scientists Warning of a Climate Emergency, and has been turning a chunk of her attention to working with local decision makers and economic planners, and wondering how how to start with that?
Well, I guess it's about getting the right people in the room. There's a beautiful thing I did recently where Patagonia, the clothing company, who are always seen as being one of the most sustainable companies in the world. You can take anything back and they'll repair it, and they give loads of money to good causes and good companies and that kind of stuff, campaigns. I was invited to a workshop of like a retreat of their European environment team. So the people in all of their different places who are their environment team across Europe did this retreat up in the mountains in Germany and surrounded by snow. And I was invited along, and because they were saying we're very sustainable, but are we acting as though this is a climate emergency? And we're really not. And so I gave a presentation a bit like we've done, and more of a workshop one evening. And the next day we did something which might be a nice event to start projects with, where I called it the Walk of What If. So we got into groups of about 6 people, and the question was, what if Patagonia, in everything that it did, acted as though this was a climate emergency? And the invitation was to go for walks in groups of 6, out in the snow, out in the trees, for an hour. And there were only a couple of rules. One was there are no limits. You know, there are no budgetary constraints on you. Don't be thinking, oh, well, that's too expensive. None of that. And that you can only respond to other people's suggestions with a yes and not yes but. So go for a walk, write down your ideas, start every question with what if, and when someone says a what if question, reply with yes and try and build off each other's ideas. It was extraordinary. And the ideas that flowed, and the people came back almost in a kind of altered state of consciousness. And then we wrote those ideas down, and we said, imagine that end of the room is really, really, really urgent, and that end of the room is not so urgent, and write the ideas down and arrange them along that continuum and in conversation with each other. So we ended up with the ideas that were most appropriate for a really, really urgent response up at one end, and then people took those ideas and they worked them up into really worked out ideas. That felt like a really powerful place to start, because we kind of gave the imagination the space it needed, and we were able to work with that. So that felt like an exercise that could really work in many, many settings, creating that kind of space for the imagination.
All right, and the last question, this is a bit of a plant. Marissa Momartz, one of my colleagues at Transition US, says, Rob, thank you for all these hopeful, inspiring stories. So needed. Do you have any other suggestions for us on how to incorporate and encourage the role of imagination in the national gathering that we have coming up this summer, which we have actually named the theme after your book, From What Is to What If, Reimagining and Rebuilding Our World?
Great name. Yeah. I would say it would be great to do some, I think that edge where activism and transition meets the arts is really, really fascinating. There's some amazing people we work with here called Encounters Arts, who do community activism, which is community arts activism work. There's a woman called Ruth Bentovim or Lucy Neal. People, it might be good to get them to kind of Skype in with some ideas. I would say to you might use that walk of what if exercise. You might in workshops bring in some people to give storytelling stuff or improv. Bring in some people to do some improv stuff with people is really great fun. To have some physical making of stuff would be really, really good. I don't know. I'll have a think about that one and send you some ideas. Yeah, I'll have a think about that one.
Well, please do. Yeah, thank you so much, Rob Hopkins, and thank
Thank
you
you,
to
and thank
every.
you all really for what you do. You know, the transition movement wouldn't be anything without people doing transition, without people like you. And you know, it's the thing that I always say when I meet groups of transition people is the transition movement, if it's anything, is a movement of stories.
Mm,
It's you know, we always say the resources are free, the materials are free. Take it, run with it, create it, do it. There's an enormous amount of trust that says
mhm,
do it and make it your own. The only condition is that you share your stories. So really, the wider movement, as someone outside the US, you know, I would say really share your stories. You know, of projects you do, projects that don't work as well. You know, gather up those stories and share your stories, because that's really what this is the lifeblood and the soul food of this organization is hearing the stories of what people are doing. So do share. And from the bottom of my heart and from everybody doing transition all around the world, thank you so much for everything that you do for this movement.